太真冷了。
你之前改一次都没改啊？
我改，我把那个改成什么？
啊，你啊，你把 Web Development 改成 Machine Learning 了？啊，那可以，没事。那个是可以。
扔在里面，用的宝还
需要选云就比较实用。
我没得选，
就一个一样。都扔在一样。
测试喜好。
努力还能到达高考。
你换成什么了 ？Web Development。
我换成那个智能家里。就跟那一样，跟你们一样，所以都有一本课程一样。
精神不太。
感冒精神。
我都想不来了。
是可以的。
我以为3点上课，我2点多出门坐，怎么又回家课？学生都少了一半，不知道去哪。
为什么呀？
今天上午上课就是老师来了以后也是就这么几个人。
好。
而且上完早上就中文版了，真的不要同学。
你们知不知道这边买电脑价钱大概跟国内是差不多是吧？
差不多，而且给你送东西。
但是现在汇率低啊。
汇率低，对，现在汇率低。
安妮买的i7，然后699，188G 的，才5000多人民币。
但是它汇率低，你是看你是用之前换的买，还是用现在新换？
这种小的电脑就是
刷新卡。
我也不太清楚。
但是价格差不多，你按照
安迪买的多少钱？699。棒。
就送一个充电线。
还送个耳机是吧？还送个大的苹果的第4款耳机。
那真疯了。
对。
真的假的？
真的。
没有，香港的是有送的。
这边也送。
这边也
真有送。
我想买那个电脑，我受不了。
那个电脑。电脑这么大，15寸的。
它这有点像科学好的外星人。
但是外星人那个电脑真的，电影你看一下它。多少钱啊？这我看一下。
就感觉白宿舍里面有融合一个单台是
它是以日本的。
是日本的对吧？外星人。
不是啊。
不是日本的。
戴尔。然后微信是台湾。
它的目的是干嘛的？
打游戏。
高兴，他以高兴
打游戏。我看这边好多人都是带那个外星人过来的，加上你说的这个女的18个人在一起。可能就我们2个是上到6点钟。心里面好疼。
他上不上课呀？然后我电脑特别我打开网页的速度
就这种
醉了，但是上网
你应该经常看到，就是那个 get set 它是你这么打出来的时候，它是已经是一种默认的方法，只有 get set 才能这么写是吧？
这是 H 头里面是吧？声明是吧？其实它这种写法有点像 Java 的感觉的嘛，你看本身是 Java。
就只有 get set 的方法才能这么写。
其他的可能也得写。VC 里面都得那些方法都得声明。
这个其实就是个声明。
对。你方法都得写的，变量也得写的。
Java 是一开始你要写声明 就头里面。
对，内放在它这是对内的声明，其实内的声明都放在头里。
这样。
不是，对，也得写。
一般是写的头上。
哦，我知道。我们之前有做赖的时候，它就有 do get， 就 pose 两个。
不是，这个不是声明。我突然记起来了，我就是因为这个，它是一个声明，它这个声明的身边就已经有一些东西，就是你一般你Java写完声明之后，你要提出这个方法，你究竟是干什么？但是它定义完这个就没了。
它这个是在 CS 里，这是 CS 里。
它就直接用了，就是直接用了，我也不知道为什么。它就直接有那个 get 设的方法。
Sorry for the delay. I've forgotten how technical it was setting up the system to actually work on the desktop machine. We're going to have to switch back and forth between that and the laptop. There's just some software I don't have on this machine to demonstrate what we're doing today. What we're going to do today is twofold. First, we're going to look at some of the HTML submissions just to pick out some best practices. Maybe there'll be a couple of highlighting things that you probably shouldn't do as your approach, and talking about the general lesson from that. Then we're going to go and look at HTTP, which I believe you covered with Nick yesterday. Is that right? We spoke a bit about that. We'll go through some work examples and look at some of the software tools that are available to let you do HTTP communications a little bit easier than having to do it manually. In fact, what we'll do is we'll do the most manual one first and show how much of a pain that is, and then have a look at some of the tools that enable us to do HTTP a little bit with a little bit of support. And then we'll set the task for this week, which will be to do some HTTP and demonstrate that you've done that. So, HTML task. How did you guys get on? How did you find it? You did it? Who worked on it last week? Who did it? What was the rest of you doing? Any thoughts on it? What was difficult? What was easy? Did you get what was going on? It was annoying. Annoyingly long. Why? Why was it annoyingly long?
Well, depending on what you had to do, it could have been quite a bit of text that you had to put in yourself.
If you had to type it in. Yeah. So, the email or something like that tended to have a lot.
Let's say the TV schedule or the restaurant menu.
Well, I guess you could have done a sample of that. It didn't necessarily have to be thousands of pages of text to demonstrate. Right, yeah, please.
Another thing that came out to me, and I know some of the group members are here, was how to work collaboratively on the code effectively. We sort of did the gather around the monitor thing, and we obviously got the job done, and we did as good a job as we could. I know of software such as Google Cloud or the OneDrive that they collaboratively edit documents. HTML is, of course, a type of document, and as such, I haven't done any research and haven't had the chance yet, but I wondered if, as a way to overcome that challenge, you know of any way to collaboratively edit code. I think that would help across, so that we could all edit certain bits at certain times.
There's a couple
that was the main challenge.
A couple of cloud IDEs. If you search Cloud IDE, Cloud without an E, then you'll find some that let you do this. So Cloud 9 is one that I've used. Basically, it gives you a text editor, but within your browser, and it's then collaborative, so multiple people can then work on that at the same time. So that might be that's a very good point, given that you're working on this together. You might want to have a tool available to you that lets you collaborate on the same thing. To be fair with the scale of task, and because we're not assessing individually for these group tasks, it's less of an issue that the idea is that you're thinking together to solve the problem as opposed to necessarily all having to contribute to that. when it comes to the coursework, it's individual. You've all got to do your own work. But for this, you're working together to learn. This is a learning exercise as opposed to us trying to find out whether you can do this or not.
Sure, I think that might be an aid to learning insofar as that we could see, because obviously there's only so many people that fit in one space. Obviously, using a projector can help, and I do concur with students.
Yeah. What space did you do this? Just to, like,
it was a meeting room.
You did find a meeting room?
Yeah, we managed to book a meeting room. There wasn't a projector available though.
Okay.
With 4 of us, yes. So hopefully there'll be more.
A little bit of elbow room problems.
Yeah. So it's more about seeing the code as they then make the change, and obviously you can, and the formatting, because you can use OneDrive obviously, but it doesn't have the nice brackets and the nice colours and the visual side.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right, let's go through a couple. I picked out a couple of the things, a couple of the examples that I wanted to point out at. I'm actually going to point out a couple of things not to, or to try and avoid for the first couple, and we'll look at some of the, a couple that had like interesting decisions about the type of markup to take. This one looks quite nice. So we've got a layout that looks sort of what we might expect for a receipt. But I was a bit concerned by the amount of non-semantic information in the document markup. So if you notice, almost all of the tags are div or span, and it doesn't really give us any sense of what the structure of the document is. Div and span have no real semantic meaning other than they are a block of text or a line of text. There's no real explanation of how that information in there is meant to be structured or combined. Particularly for a task like this, I'd recommend staying away from div and span when you're trying to mark up your document in a way with meaning. They're super useful when it comes to doing stylistic work. So when you need to lay things out, you need to structure your document so you can present it well. Then div and span have a role. But in this situation where we want to try and concentrate on marking up the document with meaning as opposed to marking up for presentation, div and span are worth staying away from. Are there any questions on that? Right, what's the next one? So this had 2 bits in it. I'm going to skip down to the what is the email, because there's an interesting part about laying this out. So we've got where are we? We've got table. So the table tags have been used here to sort of produce something that has multiple bits of information in it. But I don't think that's been fully used fully used as much as it can be. So what the table's been used here to separate out the image and the store the table over the top. To separate out what's going on with the image and to make a table like that, to separate the image from the text. But arguably, we should also be making each of these a separate row, because they are separate pieces of information. What the developer of this has done is use something called a BR tag, which is to create a new line. And it's not particularly good practice to use BR tags to do that sort of presentational layout of your page. Having used, if there had been used different rows for each of these, I think we'd be structuring that a little bit better, and possibly even these 2 parts, because there is like a label and a value for each of these, making that a subtable in its own right, where you have a value on the left of the table and a value on the right. The table tag, just to address it while we're here, or what we're talking about, it is supposed to be for tabular data. It has been overloaded in HTML pages for presentational purposes. People use tables all over the place to put things in where on the page they want it to be, as opposed to representing the information in the page. And really, a tabular data was it's one of those tags that's been around since the days that HTML was invented for physicists, and it's there for them to present data like the X and Y values from their readings, and they've got a whole bunch of numbers that they've recorded from from a hadron collider or something like that. And that's the intended semantics of the table, is that you're presenting data in a tabular form. It's the sort of things that you might put in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. That's what table is intended for. I think there are some cases, and I think we see there's an example a little bit later, where it is using one of these documents to represent some of the data. I think it's a receipt as tabular data, and that sort of makes sense. I think you can make an argument for a receipt being a table of data with two different columns of information. Unfortunately, here it's been used mostly for presentation. The purpose, it seems that the reason that the developer of this has used it is to lay out an image next to some text, and they wanted it to look like that, as opposed to that being semantically meaningful. And in fact, with the BR tags, really that's just one piece of data within that table, and that text is equivalent to just like 11 in the column there. But really, there's 3 different bits of data there, and nothing about the structure is telling the machine or the person reading this that each of those are a separate thing. We're relying on the visual semantics when it's being rendered, for a human to be able to see that those are separate bits of information. But a machine couldn't necessarily work that out unless it's making big assumptions about why you're using the BR tag. Whereas if you separate those into rows, there would be some information about the fact that they're separate. Yeah.
Yeah. A question about that. Obviously, the developers here have used BR tags. In terms of that being bad practice, what would be the good practice? You mentioned obviously rows there. Using XML was beyond the scope of the task, I believe. If you were to use XML as a representation format for that information, would you still use a table, or would you use something else? In essence, for this purpose, it was enough to have it as text.
Yeah.
But in the future, if you wanted that information to be pulled from somewhere, would you still use a table and rows, or would you use something different? Or
if you were using XML, depending on the data type, or the data that was in here, you'd presumably have a DTD, a language for describing this data within your XML. So absolutely, you'd use the XML that would be more appropriate for that. It's purely because we're trying to structure this as a document, but we're trying to use the documents, the language that documents allow us to represent this. And the point I'm trying to make is that we're leaning too far towards using what the languages documents allow us to do presentation here, as opposed to structuring the meaning of the document. Absolutely, yeah. Questions at any time, please.
I'm really confused when it was appropriate to use left and right justification and things like that in the text rather than in CSS. But not able to present. I just can't see the boundary, or well, it's not mattering in the end when we've done style sheets.
What do you mean when it was appropriate? What? You're saying you're not sure when it was appropriate to use left and right?
I can't hear, but we talked about whether we should use HTML to right justify and left justify and centre things, and other people in the group said before said no, you shouldn't be using HTML for that. So we didn't.
Good.
Put it in. Was that the right decision?
I think so, yeah.
Right, okay.
Using HTML to do left and right justification is a presentational issue.
That's what we...
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, all that does is change how it renders when it goes into the web browser. It doesn't give you any information about, any different information about what that text in between that is means, other than it's just presentational. It's not meaningful. It's not semantic. Okay, another one. Just wanted to jump over here briefly for. I just wanted to highlight, and this wasn't anything to do with the structure, but more about presentation of the HTML. There is. Because HTML and the element structure, the document object model is hierarchical, it is typical, or it's good practice in terms of presenting your code to indent as you go in, once you're inside each of the levels. So this is a little bit difficult to see, like what the depth is within this tree, because everything's like hard aligned to the left. And it's good practice to put like tabs in there. There is software that will do this automatically for you. So in here, what am I going to do? So there is software that will do that automatically for you, and you end up with something a little bit like this. And you see every time you go inside a tag, the next bit of code within that is indented one. If you programmed in programming languages like Python and Java and stuff like that, you'll be used to this idea, but if you've not come across it, then it's worth highlighting. It's mostly sort of good manners so that when other people look at your HTML, they're able to read it a little bit better. You'll notice though that even the browsers these days will do that. Depending on the views you get of your code, often the browser will do a lot of that for you as well. Okay, right, on to this one. So this was TV listings, which I thought used an interesting choice of elements. So who's this? Is anyone here? This is you. Excellent. So talk us through how you structured the information like here, so that each of these bits. Do you remember? Yeah.
We use these tags, didn't we? DT and DD for set times on HTML. I'm trying to remember what we actually did.
Yeah. So it's the DT and the DD that I'm interested in. So what do you remember what that?
I remember a question about it. It was a kind of short form and a long form of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's called a definition list. So the tag is DL. It's one of the lesser used HTML structures, but it's a little bit like a list, but it's a list that has two parts to it, and you use it to do things like glossaries and other sort of dictionaries, things where you have a word or a name or something like that, and then a more detailed definition of it. So you use DT to describe the term, so the description term, and then you use DD to then expand that and have the explanation. For the TV listings, I think it's I think this is one of these areas where it very much becomes is it quite right or is it not quite right? I think it's quite a good it's a good example of using DT and DD. I'm quite glad you put it in there because it's a set of tags that don't often appear. But definitely we've got a thing that is like the title, that is something that's shorthand for what's going on there. But then also you want a more detailed description of that, and that appears in the DD. So we've applied some semantics to the information that we've got in there. So something processing this. So for example, if you had an application that was processing this document, and maybe it wanted to display on a smaller screen where it had less space to do this. It might hide the DD, because this is extra information. The user might not always want to see this, but they definitely need to see the title of the program. And that means the machine is able to apply some knowledge to your particular document and make adjustments to it, because it can try and understand what you're doing here because you've used some semantics through the tags. It can say this is shorthand, this is a longer description, and it might choose to present that slightly differently if it's appropriate or if it needs to. So good work. Did anyone else use the description list? DT, DD? Okay. I thought I'd seen it in a couple of other places. Okay, next one. Menu with some delicious looking desserts. So this one. What was nice here? So yeah, I sort of wanted to pose a question for everyone here. Like the sides in particular. So we've got 3 items there. I think there's a decision to be made, and clearly the group doing this went one way, and that is, do we represent each of these things as a paragraph, as like a separate set of wording within this document, or what's the other approach we would take? What else would we use? A list, yeah. So because it's a group of items one after another, it could also work as a list. I'm not sure which way. Should we have a vote? So who thinks that this works as paragraphs? Who thinks it's a good idea to use paragraphs? Oh, no one. That didn't go how I expected. Who thinks this should be done as a list? Okay. Yeah, I personally think it works as both. But there's probably a slight preference towards a list, just because it's definitely something that is clearly 3 separate things that are related as something underneath this heading. Why do you think list? Why do you think not paragraph? Anyone who said list?
Because it could be more than this. It has so many information on each line. There's a description of price.
Well, that's interesting. So actually, that's a good point in itself. Is that should we have done something semantically to separate the description and the price because they're actually 2 bits of data? Potentially, a table might have been appropriate there. In fact, let's look at an example that does just that. So there is an example that uses of a receipt that uses a table in this exact way. So each row of the table, so each TR, has the description, the item that was purchased, and a price as a separate thing. This is definitely tabular data, isn't it? It's definitely, there is a thing, there is a price, each one lines up on a row, each row has to have both of those things. Definitely representing this bit of the receipt is tabular data, and that certainly makes sense. And again, there's sort of some semantics there to say, to allow a machine to read this as a table and interpret it as it needs to. It would be fair for a machine to read this and go, oh, it's a table, I could sort it by price, I could sort it by one of the columns or another, or treat it as you might treat it. Okay, right, that will do for HTML feedback. Are there any questions about that? I guess I should summarise. The key thing to be looking for here is that separation of the presentation and the meaning of what you're trying to represent. They're the two. That's the key thing we're trying to do with HTML and CSS. Separate out the bit that is styling and the bit that is structuring and organising the document. And we'll see next week how that all comes together when we add styling. Okay, right, let's talk a bit about HTTP. What did Nick tell you yesterday? Someone in 2 sentences recap what you know about HTTP. Right, who went to the lecture yesterday? Okay. Tell me about HTTP. Where was the rest? That doesn't matter. Go on, Ryan.
He gave an overview of HTTP and sort of gave a flavour of sort of the types of error codes that you receive and gave examples of using the different types of protocols and sending messages to a website and reviewing how the website responded to what you asked for.
Okay. So let's step back a bit. What is HTTP? It's a protocol for
web server.
Is it different? Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Between your it is, but they're both machines. So yeah, you're right. There is your machine, which is your client, which is requesting a website, and there is a server which is sending you the website. And HTTP is the language for doing the communication both to request information from the server, but then also for the server to send information back to you. So it is the sort of set of agreed steps and instructions to allow that to happen. And it has to be standardized because otherwise the machines wouldn't know what anyone's doing at any time. Did Nick show you what a HTTP request looks like? What the elements of it? What goes into it?
HTTP version.
The status code.
Yeah. So. Well, that'll be a response. So there's a slight difference between a request and a response. So what went in? So there's the version, method. What do we mean by method? So just
Get
so who's the method?
The action you want to perform, is it a get or a post?
Get or post. Yeah, very good. Were there any others? Did Nick?
The head.
Delete.
Delete. And put.
Put. Yeah, very good. We'll talk a bit more about the semantics of each of those when we, particularly when we start talking about REST. Is there anything else that goes in there? There's a very important thing that we've missed.
URI.
Very, very good. You've got to have a resource that you are getting or posting or whatever.
Post.
And what do we said something about the response. So what does the response tell us? There was a status code that tells us whether there was an error or whether there was a whether it succeeded. We also tend to get the version back. Language. Header. So what's in the header?
The metadata.
Metadata. Yeah.
So you get some header information back, which tends to be like extra metadata about the
content. The contents type.
Very good. So the other thing you get back is the thing that you requested. Typically, if you've asked to get a URI and that URI has like a web page in it with HTML, some part of the big bit of the response, like the main part of the response, will be that HTML page.
Yeah, application language.
Sorry?
Application language.
So as in like the human language that is it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That actually language you can put in both. We'll speak a bit about that. Actually, let's put that part of the headers, e.g. So one of the things you get back in the headers is likely to be which language this is in. And you might even be told that this thing is available in other languages. There are some headers that allow you to say, can I have, you're allowed to request this in French. We also have a version in French, which can be helpful when you are trying to figure out or trying to receive other versions of the file. We are going to do some example. Did Nick do an example HTTP request?
Yeah.
Did he do it? For what software? Let's do an example.
Telnet.
Did you use curl or
you use the telnet command?
you use telnet? Oh, that was going to be my opening gambit. Let's do that again quickly. First example will be to telnet something. This is the overall way of doing HTTP requests. Telnet is a command line program. It's on top of the screen. It's available on Windows and Mac. It's sort of a standard application that you'll get in all of these operating systems. Telnet. We have to give it a website or a server to connect to and a port to connect to. The default HTTP port is 80. When you're telnetting, you have to be explicit about that. Other applications will assume it because they know you're doing HTTP work. Your browser, when you type in a web address in the browser, you don't have to explicitly say port 80. Because it will assume that.
If you see that in the diagram, what would happen?
It'll work. Look, I'll show you. I'll show you the example we're going to do. Let me look at PCS. And the way you specify it in the browser is you put colon then the number 80. You see it removes it because that's what you were expecting. If you try to go to like port 81. You'll just say that you can't access the page because port 81 isn't open to us. Okay, so if we tell it to that on port 80, it'll connect and then wait for us to do something. The thing that we do, IPv6, it is indeed, you can tell that because of the IP address there. And what do? We say HTTP, I don't know what it is now, it's 1.1. So we say, right, get the URI that we want, and because we just want the root address of the whole site, we just put a slash, and then we have to say the version of the HTTP that we want. So the three elements there are the method we want to do, the resource that we want to do it on,
the protocol.
That's so the server knows to respond in the appropriate way, because we might only support a particular protocol. We're doing 1.1 here.
Telnet taken. Close. Yeah.
We got closed halfway through doing that. We were too slow. There we go. So as long as we send that within the
host,
within the telnet, it works. You have to put 2 enters to be able to do that, and then you get a response back. We've got 400 bad requests. We've done our HTTP. What have we done wrong? Yes, host. And an important part of the 1.1 spec, as opposed to the 1.0 spec, is that you have to provide the host header. Headers are a value, a colon, a key, a value, and a colon and a value. And our host is www.ecs.ac.uk. Explaining this at the same time as typing it is not easy. Get HTTP 1.1 host. You might say, well, didn't we already provide that information when we connected? Yes, you did. But the point of providing the host as part of the HTTP request is that server, that entire machine, might host multiple websites. So when you connect to it, You then need to say, actually, I want www.ecs rather than, what else do we host here? Tottle.ecs or something like that. So you're being explicit about which website that you want. And as you saw, hopefully, we got a whole load of HTML back as a response for that. And that is the HTML for the ECS homepage. I recommend trying this at home and copying and pasting that into a HTML file, saving it and opening it in your browser, just to prove that is definitely the code for that. But okay, right, that is one tool for doing that. There is another tool that is on the command line called curl, C-U-R-L. And this is like Telnet on steroids. It does a whole bunch more stuff for you to make this a lot easier. I'm going to show a visual tool for this as well. So if you're not command line savvy, don't worry, you don't have to do command line all the time. I recommend trying it once or twice just to be aware that it's a possibility. So curl, we can ask the command just to be given a particular page. And we'll see that there's a bunch of options that we need to turn on to actually do anything. So when we curl, for example, m.wikipedia.org, we get nothing back. There's no response there. And it's worth then it's useful to be aware there is a -v flag which tells the command to be verbose. It tells it to tell us everything it's doing at each step. And as soon as we do that, then we'll see each of the bits that it's doing along the way. And part of that, you'll notice that there's little arrows to say whether this is information going to the server or coming back from the server. So this is the command to send. So all we did was we wrote curl -v in Wikipedia. It did those lines, the get HTTP and the host is Wikipedia, for us. So we didn't have to type all that ourselves. So instantly it's become a little bit easier to do. But then we also get a HTTP response. As part of the response, we get the version, stats code, and headers. Sorry? And the response we've got here, so we've been responded to in HTTP 1.1, and the stats code is 301, which is a redirect. It means go to this other page, or this other site, to continue. And you get told which site that is in the location header. That's why the headers are useful, because they often give you extra information about the response code you've got. And what that's telling us to do is to redirect to HTTPS m.wikipedia. So the first thing it does whenever you connect to that address is redirect you over to the secure version, the HTTPS version. Curl has a shortcut for making that happen automatically, which is -L. And -L tells it to follow redirects. So when we got a redirect, it would then issue the command to HTTPS Wikipedia. So you see there, issue another request to this URL. So it's got the 301 from the first request. Then it's doing another one to the HTTPS. Then we get HTTP response 302 found. It's found the document. And then we get redirected again to a page where we do a request and we get 200. So 200 is the OK status. You're succeeded in getting the thing that you wanted. You don't have to do anything more in terms of HTTP. And within that, we've got a bunch of headers, so all of these things with the colons in, and then we've got some HTML. So we've successfully done a request to get that page. It's followed a bunch of redirects, and then we've received HTML out the back end of it. And again, if we copied that into a file and put it in the browser, then we would be able to view that. Now, let's see that in a visual tool. So there is a tool available in for Chrome called Postman. There's another tool available for Firefox called REST Client. They both do a similar sort of job. This is Postman. Make that a little bit more visible. And this is a visual, a GUI application to enable you to do the same sort of stuff, to do what we did with the Telnet and to do what we did with curl. So let's have a look at a get. Let's pick a URL. Someone
BBC.co.uk.
very good. Let's try that. www.bbc.co.uk. So the way this works is you've got a box here, which is where your URI goes. You have a selection here of which HTTP method to use. We're going to use GET to begin with. And then you've got various tabs here to then do things to affect that initial response. So you might want to set headers, and again you've got this key value pairing set up. You might want to set up authorization. And that'll be useful when you're looking at posts. But if we just use a GET and we don't set any of that stuff, we can send that, and you'll see the response we get back has the headers that we got back to the response. So we'll see there's things like the length of the content and what type the content is. The content type is text HTML. And importantly, we've got that that content that we always get with the response. So this is HTML, this is the home page of the BBC website, and Postman both lets you view that as HTML, but also preview what that looks like as a page. It's not loading the styling, so you just get the raw markup of that. So you see, BBC doesn't use any HTML to do presentation. If you take away the style, it just looks like a list of links, which is what the BBC website is. It's a prettily styled list of links. So it's being very honest about its structure. Good HTML there. Okay, so let's also point out what is worth knowing. Let's have a look at trying to post something. No, let's do the accept header. Right. So there is something called the University Open Data Service. Who's seen or heard of the Open Data Service? What is it? Good answer. That's exactly what it is. It's a website that hosts information that has been made public, has been published by the university, and is openly available to both students and staff and the public. It has a website. You can access the data on the website, but you can also access it in various other data formats. And the way it does that is it relies on your accept header to define what information you want. So if you actually, what building is this? This is 35. Remember 1005. Well, so if we send a GET to that, because by default it will expect HTML, we'll get the HTML version of that page back, and you'll see the page has various information about this room, has a photo of the lecture theatre, has a map to tell you where it is, tells you the name, and that it has a bench PC and projector and all that sort of jazz. But so we haven't explicitly said what type of file we want here or what type of data, and it's assumed HTML. But we could set the header, and we need to tell it the content type. Is that right? No, the accept. So there is a header called accept, and you'll see there's a bunch of different accept headers. There's things like accept language, so your browser could list which human languages you accept. So you might prefer to receive your content in French or Chinese or something like that, and your browser would do that by sending the accept language header to a web server, and the web server will then try and fulfill that request, or the character set of the encoding. But we're going to accept a particular file type, and we're going to use application RDF XML. So if we go application /RDF XML, When we send that, the service will try and respond in XML, well, in RDF, encoded in XML, rather than trying to do it in HTML. Hopefully, he says hopefully. So if we send that, the response we get back, as you'll see from the first tag, is in RDF rather than XML. And that's exactly the same URI. There's the exact same resource, but we've just requested it in a different format by explaining what data type we accept, as opposed to changing the URL. And this is a sort of an accepted approach, or the expected approach, for being able to request different types of data from a web server. Hopefully highlights to you like the use of the accepted. I'm going to do an example of the post that we're running at the time, but before you go, it's worth pointing out that on the edge share, for today's lecture, there is an example of each of the things. Example of how to do this in Telnet, how to do it in Postman, how to change the user agent, things like that. So I recommend having a go going through this to get practice, and then working on doing one of those for a new website each. So I'd like you for your week's challenge, or your week's group challenge, to do a get request, a head request, and a post request to 3 different websites. So choose your websites carefully, and then document, log that in some way, so screenshots or copies of the terminal output, and then submit that to Andy. I'll clarify those instructions over email, so you have a written documentation of that. That's it. Any questions?
也是写东西做的东西，然后因为他是写文正反推的，你第一种反推的文档格式，你正确的应该是 HTML test， 你还有一些你发送的请求不一定是，
就比如说你RDF
对，可以，
但你可以写译成 XML，
对，
你可以写 XHTML，
可以。